Richard and Helen Grant were chuckling. They were seated just across the aisle, murmuring to their attorney. They radiated confidence, happiness. You could almost see the dollar signs spinning in their eyes, the $5.5 million fortune already spent in their imaginations. They believed this would be a cakewalk. To them, I was a nobody, some greedy stranger standing between them and a life of luxury. I was just an obstacle. I reached up and adjusted the blue woolen hat on my head. Its familiar, slightly coarse texture was a comfort, a link to the man who had actually been my father, the man they were now branding a kidnapper. A slight tremor ran through my hands, but I kept my expression a mask of calm. I watched them exchange another smirk. They had absolutely no clue who I really was. They couldn't know that the little girl they had discarded in an airport terminal 30 years ago was now sitting less than 5 feet away. A hush fell over the courtroom. The large, imposing wooden doors swung open. The bailiff rose to his feet, his voice booming into the silence. "All rise," he commanded. "This court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Alexandra Croft presiding." Richard and Helen stopped laughing. The blood drained from their faces in an instant. Their eyes darted from the empty judge's bench to me, watching as I stood. They had come here expecting a stranger to decide their fate. What they got was their daughter. Before we get into the heart of this, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from around the globe. I have to take you back to the day my life truly began. It wasn't the day I was born. It was the day I turned 5 and I was standing on the grimy, patterned carpet of JFK International Airport. I remember the drive there with perfect, haunting clarity. It's funny what a child's mind holds on to. I can't tell you what I ate for breakfast that morning, but I can still smell the inside of that car. It was a sour mix of old coffee and a cheap cherry air freshener, an odor that made my stomach clench. I was in the back seat, small for my age, with my knees hugged tight against my chest. I was wearing my favorite sneakers, the ones with little silver rocket ships on the toes. I adored those shoes. They made me feel like I could fly away. My parents, Richard and Helen, were up front. They were silent. This was unusual. Normally, the car was filled with the sound of their arguments. They fought about rent. They fought about whose turn it was to deal with me. They fought about every little thing. But on that particular morning, the car was filled with a thick, suffocating quiet. It felt like the heavy, charged air just before a violent storm. I gazed out the window at the bleak, gray sky. New York was cold that day, the wind whipping the bare trees mercilessly. I wanted to ask where we were going. We didn't have any luggage, just 2 large, lumpy duffel bags and my little pink backpack. But I knew the rules. The cardinal rule in my world was simple. Be quiet. Silence meant safety. Asking questions would earn me Richard's shouting. Crying would earn me Helen's long, theatrical sigh, as if I were a burden too heavy to carry. So, I was quiet. I stared down at my rocket ship shoes and clamped my mouth shut. We pulled up to the departures curb. The airport was a chaotic symphony of honking cars and people scurrying in every direction. Richard killed the engine but didn't look back at me. He just looked at Helen. "Let's get this done," he muttered. Helen gave a tight nod. She looked ghostly pale, and her hands trembled as she pushed her door open. I scrambled out of the back. The noise was a physical blow. Roaring buses, shrill whistles, people yelling. It was terrifying. I instinctively reached for Helen's hand, needing to hold on, needing her to tell me everything was all right. She snatched her hand away fast, like my touch had burned her. "Get your bag, Alexandra," she said, her voice sharp as glass. And don't dawdle. I hoisted my pink backpack onto my shoulders. It held a coloring book and a little box with 3 crayons. That was everything I owned. We entered the terminal. It was cavernous, with a ceiling that soared into the heavens and lights that cast a harsh, yellow glare. The sheer number of people was dizzying. I had to half-run to keep up with Richard's long, hurried strides. He moved with a purpose, like a man fleeing a fire. We journeyed deep into the airport, past all the check-in desks and security lines. This was back in 1994, when you could walk all the way to the boarding gates without a ticket. We finally stopped in a seating area by a massive window overlooking the tarmac. Richard dropped the 2 duffel bags with a dull thud. He swiped a bead of sweat from his brow. "Here," he said, "sit." I perched on one of the bags. The stiff plastic handle bit into the back of my leg, but I didn't dare complain. Helen was scanning the area, her eyes wide and nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder. "Alexandra," Richard said, his gaze finally falling on me. His eyes were cold, the color of a frozen puddle. "We need to go speak to a man about our tickets. You stay right here. Watch these bags." "Okay," I whispered. "Don't you move," Helen added, her eyes finally meeting mine. I searched her face for a flicker of love, a hint of sorrow. There was nothing. All I found was relief. That's the image that has seared itself into my memory. She wasn't sad to be leaving me. She looked like someone who had just set down an impossibly heavy weight. She looked free. "We'll be right back," Richard said. "Count to 1,000. We'll be back before you're even done." "Okay, Daddy," I said. They turned and walked away. They moved quickly, their forms shrinking as they melted into the river of travelers. They never looked back, not even once. I watched them go. I watched Helen's green coat vanish. I watched the back of Richard's head until it was just another face in the crowd. I began to count. 1, 2, 3. I counted slowly, meticulously. I wanted to do it perfectly. I thought if I was a good girl and counted just right, maybe they'd come back with a treat for me, like a soft pretzel. 55, 56, 57. Strangers bustled past, their wheeled suitcases making a rhythmic click-clack on the polished floor. A few glanced at me, but most didn't see me at all. I was just another piece of scenery, a kid waiting for her parents. 100. My feet started to dangle and swing. I looked up at the giant clock on the wall. The long red second hand seemed to crawl. 200. My stomach rumbled. I was getting hungry. I wished I'd thought to ask for something to eat. The sweet smell of cinnamon drifted from a nearby Cinnabon, making my mouth water. I told myself to be patient. Richard would bring food when he came back. He had to. 300. The demographics of the crowd started to shift. The morning rush was subsiding, and the terminal grew a little quieter. A cold knot of fear began to form in my chest. 400. I slid off the bag and stood up, craning my neck to look in the direction they had gone. I searched for a green coat, for Richard's tall frame. I saw a sea of strangers, but not them. 450. My voice was a shaky whisper now as I continued the count. Tears started to burn at the back of my eyes. I blinked them back fiercely. "Be a big girl," I scolded myself. "Big girls don't cry. If you cry, they'll be angry." 999. I paused, holding my breath, my heart pounding in my ears. I waited. 1,000. I scanned the area desperately. No one came. I kept counting. 1,100, then 1,200. I sat back down on the duffel bag. The airport's noise level rose and fell with the rhythm of arriving and departing flights. The light slanting through the huge windows changed from the bright white of morning to the warm gold of afternoon. I really had to use the bathroom, but I held it. I was terrified to move. Richard had said, "Don't you move." If I moved, they might walk right past me. If I moved, it would be all my fault that they couldn't find me. So I stayed. I sat there for hours. My legs went numb. My stomach ached with a dull, gnawing hunger. But the sharpest pain wasn't physical. It was the slow, agonizing dawning of a terrible truth. Even at 5 years old, a part of me was beginning to understand. I replayed their faces, their actions. I saw Richard's frantic pace. I saw the way Helen had recoiled from my touch. They hadn't forgotten me. You forget your keys. You forget where you parked your car. You don't forget your child. They had left me. I pulled my knees up to my chin, wrapping my arms around my shins, making myself as small as I possibly could. I wished I could just disappear. I felt like the most insignificant thing in this enormous echoing space. I was garbage. I was something they had thrown away because they didn't want the expense of taking me with them. The tears came then. I cried without a sound, a silent hot river flowing down my cheeks and dripping onto my little rocket ship shoes. I don't know how much time passed. It felt like an eternity. The sun began to set, and the airport lights flickered on, seeming brighter and more clinical than before. The shadows grew long and distorted on the carpet. People still rushed by, each one trapped in their own little bubble of purpose. To them, I was invisible. Or maybe they saw me and chose not to see. A crying child in an airport is just part of the background noise. But there was one man. I noticed him because he wasn't moving. Everyone else was a blur of frantic motion, but he was still. He was sitting on a bench across from me, a book open in his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was watching me. A new jolt of fear went through me. Richard had always warned me about strangers, that they were dangerous. I scrubbed my face with the sleeve of my sweater and tried to look brave, like my parents were just around the corner. The man stood up. He was tall and slender, wearing a slightly rumpled gray suit. He had kind eyes behind a pair of glasses. He didn't walk fast like Richard. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. He stopped a few feet away, careful not to crowd me. Then he knelt down on one knee, bringing himself to my level. "Hi there," he said. His voice was soft and deep, a gentle rumble. I didn't respond, just pressed my lips together into a thin line. "My name is Arthur," he continued. "I've been sitting over there for a couple of hours waiting for a delayed flight. And I've been watching you." I clutched the straps of my pink backpack even tighter. "You're a very patient waiter," he said with a small smile. "You haven't budged an inch." I gave a tiny nod. "I have to wait," I whispered. "Who are you waiting for?" Arthur asked gently. "My mommy and daddy." Arthur's gaze swept across the terminal, his face clouded with a sadness I wasn't used to. It wasn't the angry, resentful sadness I saw in my parents. This was a heavy, aching sadness. "What's your name?" he asked. "Alexandra." He repeated it softly. "Alexandra, that's a lovely name. Where did your parents go, Alexandra?" "To get tickets," I recited. "They said to count to 1,000. Arthur glanced at his watch and then back at me. He took a slow, deep breath. "And did you finish counting?" "A long time ago," I said, my voice cracking. A fresh tear traced a path down my cheek. Arthur moved a little closer. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crisp white handkerchief. He held it out to me. "Alexandra," he said, his voice very serious now, "I have to tell you something, and I need you to be very brave." I took the handkerchief. It smelled clean, like peppermint. "I don't think they went to get tickets," Arthur said softly. "They did," I insisted, my voice rising. "Daddy said so." Arthur shook his head slowly. I saw them leave, Alexandra. I saw them walk right out the exit doors. They got into a taxi a long, long time ago. The words felt like a punch to my stomach. No, I said, no. They're coming back. Arthur looked me straight in the eye. He wasn't lying. All the adults in my life lied to me. They said this won't hurt or we'll see. But Arthur's eyes held only the truth. They aren't coming back, honey, he said. The words hung in the air between us, terrible and final. But they were true. I knew they were true because I could feel it deep in my bones. I started to sob then, not the silent crying from before, but a loud, gut-wrenching wail. The dam had broken. I cried for the parents who didn't want me, for the rocket ship shoes that couldn't make me special enough to keep. Arthur didn't shush me or tell me to quiet down. He moved forward and sat right on the floor next to me. He didn't try to hug me right away, not wanting to scare me more. He just sat there, creating a solid, protective wall between me and the rest of the indifferent world. I'm not going to leave you, he said. I'm going to miss my flight, and I'm going to stay right here with you until we get this sorted out. And he did. He stayed. Eventually, a security guard ambled over, his radio crackling. Hey, whose kid is this? The guard asked, looking at Arthur with suspicion. Arthur stood up. He seemed to grow taller, stronger. She has been abandoned, Arthur stated, his voice now hard as steel. Her parents left her here hours ago. I need you to call the police, and I need you to get a social worker here immediately. The guard looked taken aback. Are you the father? No, Arthur said firmly. I'm just the person who isn't leaving her. The next few hours were a confusing haze of uniforms and endless questions. Police officers came. They asked my name, my address. I recited it perfectly, just as I'd been taught. 421 Elm Street. They opened the duffel bags my parents had left. They were both empty, stuffed with wads of old newspaper to give them weight. That was the moment the true calculated cruelty of it all hit me. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. They had packed empty bags. They had planned this. They had planned to deceive me. I sat on a hard plastic chair in the airport police station, shivering from cold and exhaustion and a deep, soul-level emptiness. Then a hand appeared in front of me, holding a warm pretzel dotted with coarse salt. I looked up. It was Arthur. He was still there. He had his suit jacket draped over his arm and looked exhausted, but he offered a small, weary smile. I told you I wouldn't leave, he said. Eat this. You need your strength. I took the pretzel and bit into it. It was warm and soft and tasted like safety. Dr. Arthur Coleman was a complete stranger. He didn't have to get involved. He could have just boarded his plane and gone back to his comfortable, quiet life. He could have just pretended he didn't see a little girl crying on a duffel bag. But he stayed. Later that night, a woman from Child Services arrived. She was professional and efficient, all business with her clipboard, ready to process me into the foster care system. Arthur argued with them in the hallway. I could hear his raised voice. I want to know where she's going, he demanded. I want to be able to check in on her. I am a doctor, a respectable citizen. You will not just let her vanish into the system. Before they took me away, he came back to say goodbye. He knelt down again. Alexandra, he said, this is not the end. This is a terrible beginning, but it's not the end. You're going to be okay. Will you come back? I asked, my voice trembling, terrified he would be just like Richard. I promise, Arthur said, and I never break a promise. He kept that promise. He visited me at the foster home every single week. He brought me books and new crayons. He battled the courts and the endless bureaucracy. As a single man in those days, adopting a young girl was an uphill battle. They made it incredibly difficult for him. But he was relentless. He was stubborn. He was my rock. 2 years later, I walked out of a courthouse holding his hand. My name was legally Alexandra Coleman. I was no longer the girl left behind at an airport. I was the girl who was chosen. Arthur saved my life, not just by giving me food and a home, but by telling me the truth that day. He taught me that truth can hurt, but lies can destroy. My parents' lie that they were coming back would have kept me waiting on that bag forever. Arthur's truth, as painful as it was, set me free. And now, 30 years later, staring at Richard and Helen in this courtroom, I remembered that lesson. I remembered the empty duffel bags. I remembered the taste of that pretzel. And I knew exactly what I had to do. 30 years later, I was standing in the rain again, but this time I wasn't at an airport. I was in a cemetery. I was 35 years old, a judge. People addressed me as Your Honor. I had a law degree hanging on my office wall and a black robe in my closet. But standing there beside the open grave, I felt like that 5-year-old girl all over again, small, frightened, and utterly alone. We were burying Arthur. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep, his heart simply giving out. It was a gentle end for the gentlest of men, but for me it felt like my world had shattered. The funeral was crowded. Arthur had been a beloved family doctor for 40 years, mending broken bones and patching up skinned knees for half the town. People came to offer their condolences. "I'm so sorry, Alexandra," they'd say. "He was a wonderful man." I would nod and shake their hands, but I couldn't find my voice. A tight knot of grief was lodged in my throat. I was wearing a blue woolen hat. It was old and a little scratchy, a gift from Arthur on our first Christmas together. I wore it like a piece of armor, needing to feel his presence close to me. After the service, I went to the office of Arthur's lawyer, Mr. Henderson, a longtime friend of his. The office smelled of old leather and peppermint, a scent that usually brought comfort, but today only deepened my sense of loss. I sank into a large leather armchair, expecting the meeting to be brief. Arthur had lived a modest life. He drove a 10-year-old sedan, and we lived in a small, charming house with a porch that always needed a fresh coat of paint. He rotated the same 3 suits for as long as I could remember. I assumed he'd left me the house, the car, and perhaps enough to cover a few months of expenses. Mr. Henderson adjusted his spectacles and looked at a thick file. "Alexandra," he began, "did Arthur ever discuss his investments with you?" "No," I said. "He never really cared about money. His passion was helping people." Mr. Henderson offered a sad, small smile. "That he certainly did. But he was also exceptionally shrewd. And he worried about you, Alex. He wanted to ensure you would always be secure." He turned a page. "Back in the 90s, Arthur invested a bit of money in some small tech startups, obscure companies dealing in computer components, early software, things no one was paying attention to." I just stared at him, confused. "Okay. Well, Alexandra, those companies became very, very large." Mr. Henderson slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany desk. It had a number printed on it, a very, very long number. The total value of the estate, after all taxes have been paid, is $6.2 million. The air left my lungs. The room started to tilt. "What?" I whispered. $6.2 million, Mr. Henderson repeated gently. He never touched a penny of it. He just let it grow. He always said it was your safety net. He wanted you to have the freedom to do anything you dreamed of. I looked at the number, but it didn't seem real. It felt like something from a board game. Arthur, my quiet, humble father who meticulously clipped coupons, was a secret multimillionaire. And he'd never said a word. He just saved it all. For me. Tears welled in my eyes. It wasn't about the money. I couldn't care less about the money. It was the sheer overwhelming proof of his love. He had spent 3 decades building an unshakable fortress for the little girl who had been thrown away, making sure I would never have to stand on a curb waiting for someone to come back for me ever again. "It's all yours, Alexandra," Mr. Henderson said softly. "The house, the accounts, all of it." I went home to our house, now eerily silent. It felt hollow. I made myself some tea and sat on the sofa, clutching the blue hat in my lap, feeling the immense weight of his love and my gratitude. I thought the worst part was over. I thought grief was the only battle I had left to fight. I was profoundly wrong. It took exactly 48 hours. 2 days after the funeral, my doorbell rang. A man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit stood on my porch. He wasn't a friend or a former patient of Arthur's. "Are you Alexandra Coleman Croft?" he asked robotically. "Yes," I said. He thrust a thick envelope into my hands. "You've been served." He spun on his heel and walked away without another word. I stood on the porch, my mind reeling. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. As a judge, I knew what this was. I tore open the envelope. The formal legal header at the top of the page seemed to leap out at me. Superior Court of New York. Plaintiffs, Richard and Helen Grant. Defendant, the estate of Arthur Coleman. I froze solid. The names jumped off the page like venomous spiders. Richard and Helen, my biological parents. I hadn't seen or heard from them in 30 years. I didn't even know if they were still alive. But somehow, they knew about me. And more importantly, they knew about the money. News of Arthur's estate must have been a matter of public record, or perhaps they saw an obituary mentioning his beloved daughter. However they found out, they had moved with lightning speed, faster than they had ever moved to come back for me at the airport. I read the first paragraph of the lawsuit, and my knees buckled. I had to sink down onto the porch steps to keep from falling. They weren't just suing for the money. They were attempting to rewrite history. I sat on the cold concrete and read the document. The sun was shining, birds were singing, but in my head I was back in that dark car, choking on the smell of stale coffee and cherries. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of fiction, a lie so audacious it stole my breath. The document painted Richard and Helen Grant as loving, doting parents who had been victims of a horrific tragedy. It alleged that on the date of November 14, 1994, the plaintiffs were tragically separated from their minor child during a chaotic emergency situation at JFK International Airport. Separated, that's the word they used, as if we had simply lost each other in a crowd, as if they had turned around for a second and I had vanished. I forced myself to keep reading. It got worse. The plaintiffs searched frantically for their daughter, it claimed. However, the defendant, Dr. Arthur Coleman, unlawfully took custody of the child and deliberately concealed her whereabouts from her loving family. My hands started to tremble, and I crumpled the thick paper in my fist. They were accusing Arthur of kidnapping me. They were trying to paint the man who saved me, the man who sat with me on a dirty airport floor while I cried, the man who chose me when they threw me away. They were calling him a criminal. The suit claimed intentional infliction of emotional distress. It claimed loss of consortium. It claimed they had spent 30 agonizing years grieving for their lost daughter, suffering every single day, wondering where I was. And for this immense suffering, they demanded compensation. They wanted the entire estate, the house, the car, and specifically the $6.2 million. I dropped the papers on the steps and felt a wave of nausea. I ran inside and was violently sick. When I was done, I splashed cold water on my face and looked at my reflection in the mirror. I searched for the scared little girl. for the victim. But she wasn't there. I saw a woman. I saw a judge. I saw Arthur Coleman's daughter. I walked back to the porch and picked up the papers, reading them again. This time, I read them not with my heart, but with my legal mind. The narrative was polished. They had a good lawyer. The story was engineered to pull at a jury's heartstrings. Poor grieving parents lose their child in a bustling airport. A rich, lonely doctor snatches her up. The parents find her 3 decades too late. It was a movie plot, but it was riddled with holes. If they had searched frantically, where were the police reports? If they missed me so terribly, why had they never once tried to contact the foster care agency? If they loved me, why did I so clearly remember the empty newspaper-stuffed duffel bags? The empty bags. I closed my eyes and the image was crystal clear. The way they didn't thud when Richard dropped them. The way they were designed to deceive. They hadn't found me out of a sudden surge of parental love. They hadn't spent 30 years missing my smile. They had smelled money. This was pure, predatory greed. They were willing to slander a dead man's memory to get it. They were willing to tear open all my old wounds just to finance their lifestyle. This wasn't just a betrayal of me. It was a desecration of Arthur's memory. They were twisting his greatest act of kindness into a heinous crime. I walked into the kitchen and made a strong pot of coffee. I sat at the small table where Arthur and I used to have breakfast every morning. I placed my hands flat on the familiar wood. A part of me considered settling. I could offer them $1 million, tell them to take it and disappear from my life forever. It would be easier, quieter. It would keep Arthur's good name out of the tabloids. But then I thought about my rocket ship shoes. I thought about the little girl counting to 1,000, her hope slowly dying with each number. If I paid them, I would be validating their lie. If I paid them, I would be letting them win. I would be letting them sell me all over again. No. I stood up. The kitchen was silent, but a storm was raging in my head. I wasn't 5 years old anymore. I wasn't helpless. I knew the law. I knew how to fight. They wanted a court battle. They wanted to stand before a judge and spin their web of lies. Fine. I picked up my phone. I didn't call Mr. Henderson. He was a kind estate lawyer, but I didn't need kind. I needed a shark. I dialed the number of an old friend from law school. Julian was ruthless, he was expensive, and he despised liars more than anyone I knew. "Julian," I said when he answered. "It's Alex." "Hey, Judge," he said, his tone softening. "I heard about Arthur. I'm so sorry." "Thank you," I said, my voice steady and cold. "But I don't need sympathy right now. I need to hire you." "What's going on?" "My biological parents just sued Arthur's estate for kidnapping," I said flatly. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end, followed by a low whistle. "You're joking." "I'm not. They want everything. The money, the house, his reputation. They want to tear him down for a payday." "Okay," Julian said, and I could hear the clicking of his keyboard. "What's the play?" I looked out the window at the garden Arthur had so lovingly tended. "I want to destroy them," I said. "I don't just want to win, Julian. I want to expose them for what they are. I want the entire world to know what they did to me in 1994. I want you to dig up every single skeleton in their closet." "That could get nasty, Alex," Julian warned. "Family court is a bloodbath." "I know," I said. "I'm counting on it." I hung up the phone, a strange sense of calm settling over me. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in my chest, but it was now encased in a layer of cold steel. They thought they were suing a grieving daughter. They thought they were up against a victim. They had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the girl who survived. And now, I had the money. I had the resources, and I was going to use every last penny Arthur left me to ensure they could never hurt anyone ever again. I went to my desk and pulled out a fresh legal pad. At the top, I wrote a name: Ethan Vance. He was the best forensic accountant in the state. If Richard and Helen Grant had secrets, Ethan would find them. I was officially going to war. I sat in my dining room with Ethan Vance. The table was a sea of documents, empty coffee mugs, and humming laptops. Ethan was a quiet, intense man with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He looked at numbers the way a surgeon looks at an open wound, with absolute, unflinching focus. I need to know everything, I told him. Their entire financial history, everywhere they've lived, every lawsuit they've ever been involved in, everything. Ethan just nodded. If it exists on paper or in a digital footprint, I'll find it. He worked for 3 solid days, camped out in my dining room from dawn till long after dusk. I'd hear bursts of rapid typing, then long silences, then the low murmur of his voice on the phone, speaking in a language of codes and figures. I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, going to work, putting on my robe, and sitting on the bench to adjudicate other people's lives. But my mind was always back at home with Ethan as he sifted through the filth of my biological parents' past. On the 4th day, I returned from the courthouse to a quiet house. Ethan was standing in the kitchen, not typing. He was leaning against the counter, holding a thin folder. He looked pale. I knew Ethan had seen the worst of human greed. He'd unmasked embezzlers and exposed massive corporate fraud. Very little shocked him. But today, he looked genuinely disturbed. "What is it?" I asked, my heart beginning to pound as I set my keys down. "Sit down, Alexandra," he said. I sat. "Is it bad?" "It's not what we were expecting," he said, his voice grim. "I looked into their finances, as you asked. They're destitute, drowning in debt, mostly from gambling, casinos in Vegas, Atlantic City. They owe a fortune. I figured as much," I said. "It's why they're after Arthur's money." "Yes," Ethan said, "but that's not the story." I went back further. "You said they abandoned you in 1994, so I started digging into 1995. He slid the folder across the table. It was a copy of an old court file. "I found a lawsuit," Ethan said. "Filed in Cook County, March of 1995. I looked at the cover sheet. Plaintiffs: Richard Grant and Helen Grant. Defendant: Transnational Airlines. I frowned. "They sued the airline?" "Read it," Ethan urged. I opened the file. My breath hitched in my throat. The lawsuit alleged that the airline was responsible for my disappearance. It claimed the airline staff had been negligent, that my parents had entrusted me to a gate agent who had then lost me. "That's a lie," I whispered. "They left me in the waiting area. They never even spoke to an agent." "Keep reading," Ethan said. The lawsuit was for wrongful death. I stopped cold, looking up at Ethan. "Wrongful death?" "They couldn't find you," Ethan explained, or at least they claimed they couldn't. "So they argued that you must have been abducted and likely killed as a result of the airline's lax security. They sued for damages." I flipped through the pages with numb fingers until I found the settlement agreement. The airline, clearly wanting to avoid the publicity of a trial involving a missing child, had been eager to make it go away. They settled. The number was right there in stark black and white. $500,000. "They got paid," I said, my voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "They got $500,000, Ethan corrected. In 1995 dollars, that was a huge sum of money. Enough to buy a house, to invest, to start a new life." "What did they do with it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Gambled it away," Ethan confirmed. "I traced the funds. It was all gone within 2 years. Casinos, luxury cars, expensive vacations. I stared at the wall, seeing nothing. They didn't just abandon me out of selfishness or because I was a burden. This was cold, this was calculated, this was a plan. Leave the kid behind, wait a few months, claim she was lost, and then sue the deep-pocketed corporation. I wasn't their daughter. I was a business opportunity. I was a lottery ticket. "There's one more thing," Ethan said, his voice hesitant. "To secure that settlement, they had to close the loop." "What do you mean?" Ethan reached into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a photocopy of a notarized document. The airline wouldn't pay out unless the parents legally agreed you were gone for good. They couldn't risk a child suddenly reappearing years later. They needed a death certificate, or at the very least, a legal presumption of death. I looked at the paper in his hand. I didn't want to touch it. It felt like it was radioactive. I took the document from Ethan. My hand was shaking so violently the paper rattled. It was an affidavit, a sworn statement made under penalty of perjury. The date at the top was August 12, 1995. It read, "We, Richard Grant and Helen Grant, being of sound mind, do hereby acknowledge that our minor child, Alexandra Grant, born April 4, 1989, has been missing for a period of 12 months. I read the next paragraph, my vision blurring. Despite exhaustive searches by local law enforcement and our own private investigators, no trace of the child has been found. We hereby accept the findings of the investigation that the child is presumed deceased. Presumed deceased." And then came the final blow. The line that shattered something deep inside me I hadn't even known was still intact. We agree to release transnational airlines from any and all future liability pertaining to the death of Alexandra Grant. At the bottom of the page were two signatures, Richard Grant, Helen Grant. The signatures were large and confident. They had signed my death warrant. I sat there in my own kitchen, a living, breathing woman, but according to this piece of paper, I was dead. They knew I wasn't dead, or at the very least, they knew they hadn't seen me die. They had left me on a bench. For all they knew, I could have been kidnapped or wandering the streets alone. But they didn't care. To get their hands on that check for $500,000, they had to declare me dead. And so they did. They had sold me. It wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was a literal transaction. I was a lost piece of luggage for which they had filed a claim. One child, age 5, slightly used. Value, $500,000. They cashed me in, I said, the words like ash in my mouth. Ethan nodded, his own face tight with anger. "It's fraud, Alex, massive fraud. They lied to the court in 1995, and they're lying to the court again with this new lawsuit." I stared at their signatures. "They're suing Arthur for kidnapping," I thought aloud. "Their entire case hinges on them being grieving parents who were robbed of their child." "Exactly," Ethan said. "But in 1995, I continued, a cold, hard smile spreading across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a predator. They swore under oath that I was dead. "They can't have it both ways," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You can't declare your child dead for an insurance payout and then, 30 years later, sue someone for kidnapping the very child you swore was dead." I stood up, a surge of pure, focused energy coursing through me. The shock and sadness were gone, burned away by a white-hot rage. "This is it," I said. "This is the smoking gun." I picked up the affidavit, holding it up as if it were a sacred text. "They think I'm a victim. They think I'm still that scared little girl on the bench, waiting for them to come back." I walked to the window. The rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to clear. "Ethan," I said, "make copies of this. 10 of them. Scan it. Back it up on 3 separate drives. Already done, he said. Good. I grabbed my phone and called Julian. Julian, I said, under no circumstances are you to offer them a settlement. Not 1 dime. Alex, are you sure? He asked. A trial is always a risk. I have something, I said. Ethan found something. It's over, Julian. They just don't know it yet. What did you find? I found the receipt, I said. I found the receipt for when they sold me. I hung up the phone and looked at the affidavit one last time. Presumed deceased, I whispered to myself. I wasn't dead. I was very, very much alive, and I was about to become their worst nightmare. I wasn't just going to win a lawsuit. I was going to make sure that when Richard and Helen Grant walked out of that courtroom, everyone in the world knew exactly who they were. They wanted a family reunion? They wanted to see their daughter again? Fine. They were about to get their wish, and she was going to burn their entire world to the ground with a single piece of paper. The trial began on a Tuesday. The courtroom was formal and cold, smelling of floor wax and old, heavy wood. I sat at the defense table next to Julian, dressed in my sharpest black suit. I had deliberately left my judge's robe at home. Today, I wasn't Your Honor. I was the defendant. Across the aisle, Richard and Helen were delivering an Oscar-worthy performance. Helen, in a modest blue dress, clutched a tissue, dabbing at her dry eyes whenever she thought the jury was looking. Richard sat with his shoulders slumped and his head bowed, the very picture of a broken man. They were convincing. If I didn't know the truth, I might have even felt a pang of sympathy. Their lawyer, a bombastic man named Mr. Finch, launched into his opening statement. He pointed a dramatic finger in my direction. This woman, he thundered, is the beneficiary of a terrible crime. Dr. Arthur Coleman, a man she called her father, stole a child. He deprived these loving parents of their precious daughter, robbed them of 30 years of memories. And now they seek justice. I held my face as still as granite. I didn't flinch, I didn't scowl. I let them spin their lies. Richard took the stand first, and he actually managed to produce real tears. We looked everywhere, he sobbed. We called the police. We walked the streets of New York for weeks, putting up posters of our little Alex. We never, ever stopped looking. On my legal pad, I wrote a single word: liar. Helen was next, and her performance was even more theatrical. I kept her room exactly as she left it, she told the jury, her voice thick with fake emotion. I bought her a birthday gift every single year. I prayed every night for her safe return. The jury looked moved. They were nodding along, seeing 2 heartbroken parents. They didn't see the predators beneath the masks. Then it was our turn. Julian stood, buttoned his jacket, and calmly approached the bench. The defense calls Sophie Grant to the stand, he announced. A ripple of confusion went through the courtroom. Richard and Helen's heads snapped up, their faces a mixture of shock and horror. They had no idea I had found her. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a woman walked in. She had my eyes, but she looked worn down by life, older than her 32 years. Her shoulders were stooped, and she wore a simple gray sweater. She was the sister I never got to know, the baby Helen had been pregnant with when they left me at the airport. They had kept her. She walked past her parents' table without a single glance, her face set like stone. She went straight to the witness stand and sat down. "State your name for the record," the clerk droned. "Sophie Grant," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Julian approached her. "Ms. Grant, what is your relationship to the plaintiffs Richard and Helen Grant?" "They are my parents," she said. "And what is your relationship to the defendant, Alexandra Croft?" Sophie's eyes met mine. They were filled with a deep, inherited sadness. but she offered me a small, courageous smile. "She is my big sister," Sophie said clearly. "The one they always told me was dead." Richard shot to his feet. "Objection! She doesn't know what she's talking about." "Sit down, Mr. Grant," Judge Evans ordered, her voice sharp. Julian continued. "Sophie, tell the court about your childhood. Did your parents ever speak of Alexandra?" "Yes," Sophie said, "but not like this. They didn't cry. They didn't keep her room. What did they do?" Sophie took a deep breath and reached into her handbag, pulling out a sheaf of yellowed, crumbling papers. "They celebrated," she said. The courtroom fell silent. "What do you mean?" Julian asked gently. "I found these in a box in the attic," Sophie said, holding up the papers. "They're receipts from the Lucky 7 casino in Atlantic City. They're dated November 1995, December 1995, January 1996. She held them up for the jury to see. "They told me my sister, Alex, died in a tragic accident. But whenever they talked about the money they got from it, they weren't sad. They took trips. They bought a brand new truck. They bought a boat. They called it the settlement money." Sophie looked directly at Richard, whose face was turning a blotchy red. "I grew up watching them spend the money they got for her," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength. "They treated her memory like a cash machine. And when the money finally ran out, all they did was fight. They'd blame me, say I was too expensive. They'd say, 'At least Alexandra paid for her own keep.'" Gasps echoed from the jury box. "They used my sister's disappearance to fund their gambling habit," Sophie stated, her voice ringing with conviction. "They didn't search for her, they cashed her in." Helen was shaking her head wildly. "She's lying, the ungrateful little—" "I have the journals too," Sophie cut in, her voice cold. "My mother's diaries. She wrote all about the windfall. She wrote about how lucky they were that the airline settled so quickly." Julian took the journals from her and had them entered into evidence. "No further questions," he said. Sophie stepped down from the stand. As she walked past me, I reached out and squeezed her hand. She squeezed back, her hand cold, but her grip firm. The jury wasn't looking at Richard and Helen with sympathy anymore. They were looking at them with dawning suspicion, seeing the cracks in their carefully constructed facade. But we weren't finished. We had one more piece of paper, the one that would end this farce for good. "Does the defense have any further witnesses?" Judge Evans asked. Julian stood, picking up the thin folder Ethan had given me. It contained only one document, but it was weighted with the power of absolute truth. "No witnesses, Your Honor," Julian said. "But we have one item for rebuttal. We would like to recall Richard Grant to the stand." Richard rose slowly, looking distinctly nervous now. He walked back to the stand, sat down, and fiddled with his tie, trying to project a confidence he no longer felt. Julian approached him, leaving the document face down on the table. "Mr. Grant," Julian began, "I want to be perfectly clear. You testified under oath that you have spent the last 30 years searching for your daughter, Alexandra. Is that correct?" "Yes," Richard said, "every single day. You testified that you never once gave up hope that she was alive." "Never," Richard said, trying to sound noble. "A father never gives up." "And you testified that Dr. Arthur Coleman kidnapped her, and you had no idea what had happened to her." "That's right," Richard said, his voice gaining a bit of its earlier bluster. "He stole her from us." Julian nodded slowly, then walked back to the table and picked up the paper. "Mr. Grant," he said, "do you recognize this signature?" Julian handed the document to the bailiff, who in turn handed it to Richard. Richard glanced at the paper. His face changed. It was like watching a wax figure melt under a heat lamp. The color drained away, leaving a pasty gray. His mouth fell open, but no words came out. His hands began to shake so badly that the paper rattled against the microphone. "Mr. Grant?" Julian prodded. "Is that your signature?" Richard didn't answer. He looked like he couldn't breathe. "Allow me to read it for the court," Julian said, picking up his own copy. "This is a sworn affidavit, dated August 12, 1995. It was filed in the legal case of Grant versus Transnational Airlines." Julian paused, letting his eyes sweep across the jury. It reads, and I quote, "We, Richard and Helen Grant, acknowledge that the minor child, Alexandra Grant, is presumed deceased." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Julian turned his piercing gaze back to Richard. His voice was like a whip crack. "You signed a death certificate, Mr. Grant," Julian said. "You stood before a court in 1995 and swore your daughter was dead. You accepted a settlement of $500,000 from an airline because you swore she was dead." Richard was sweating profusely now, drops running down his nose. "And yet," Julian continued, "you sit here today and tell this court that you spent 30 years searching for a child you knew was alive. You tell us that Dr. Coleman kidnapped a child who, according to your own sworn testimony, was already dead." Julian leaned in close, his voice dropping to a low, menacing snarl. "So, Mr. Grant, I have a very simple question for you." The room was so silent you could hear the clock on the wall ticking. "Were you lying in 1995 when you took the money?" Julian asked. "Or are you lying now to get more money?" Richard looked desperately toward his lawyer, who was staring down at his table, refusing to meet his client's eyes. He knew it was over. Richard looked at Helen. She had buried her face in her hands. I, Richard stammered. We thought, you thought you could get away with it," Julian finished for him. "You declared her dead to get a payday. And when you discovered she was alive and wealthy, you tried to resurrect her for another payday." Julian turned to Judge Evans. "Your Honor, this is fraud. This is perjury. The plaintiffs have filed a frivolous and malicious lawsuit based on claims they know to be demonstrably false. They have already legally accepted the death of this child. They have no standing to sue for the kidnapping of a child they themselves declared deceased 30 years ago." Judge Evans looked at Richard with undisguised contempt. She was a mother herself. I knew she had 2 young children. I could see the disgust on her face. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice ice, "you may step down." Richard stumbled away from the stand, nearly falling. Judge Evans banged her gavel, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. "Case dismissed," she declared, with prejudice. That meant they could never, ever file this suit again. But she wasn't done. "Bailiff," she ordered, "please lock the courtroom doors." Richard and Helen looked around in a panic. "I am holding both plaintiffs in contempt of court," Judge Evans announced, "and I am immediately referring this entire matter to the district attorney's office. I am recommending charges of perjury, insurance fraud, and attempted extortion." The doors at the back opened, and 2 uniformed police officers walked in, handcuffs glinting on their belts. Richard started shouting. "No, it was a misunderstanding. We didn't mean it." Helen began to scream, pointing at him. "He made me do it. It was all his idea." They turned on each other in an instant. The loving, grieving couple was gone, replaced by 2 cornered rats. I stood up and watched. The officers took Richard's arms and clicked the cuffs onto his wrists. Then they cuffed Helen. As they were being led past the defense table, Richard's wild eyes locked with mine. "Alex!" he yelled, his voice raw with desperation. "Alex, please! We're your parents! Help us!" I looked him straight in the eye. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel sadness. I felt light. I leaned forward and spoke softly, but in the pin-drop silence of the room, my voice carried. "You don't have a daughter named Alexandra," I said. "You signed a piece of paper that says she died in 1995. Richard's face crumpled. "You didn't lose me," I whispered. "You sold me." The officers dragged them away. The heavy doors slammed shut, and silence returned. But this time, it wasn't the lonely silence of an abandoned child waiting in an airport. It was the silence of peace. It was the silence of justice. Julian closed his folder and gave me a rare, genuine smile. "It's over, Alex," he said. "Yes," I replied, taking a deep breath. "It finally is." The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of headlines. The papers had a field day with the airport abandonment case, plastering Richard and Helen's faces on the front page. They no longer looked like grieving parents. They looked like what they were, common criminals. The DA moved quickly. With the affidavit as irrefutable proof, the case was a slam dunk. They were convicted of perjury and insurance fraud. They lost everything. The bank foreclosed on their house, and their so-called friends vanished. They went to prison, not for a lifetime, but long enough to understand that some debts can't be paid off with money. Their lives were ruined. But in truth, I didn't waste much time thinking about them. They were the past. I was focused on the future. I found myself back in Mr. Henderson's office, the check for $6.2 million sitting on his desk. "It's a lot of money, Alexandra," he said. "You could retire, travel the world." "I'm starting a foundation," I said, pushing the check back toward him. "I want to donate all of it." Mr. Henderson dropped his pen. "All of it?" "All of it," I confirmed. I called it the Anchor Project. People asked me about the name. Why anchor, they'd wonder, and I'd tell them the truth. Because when you're a kid in the system, you feel like you're adrift. You need an anchor. We used the money to create centers for teenagers who were aging out of foster care. In this country, when a foster kid turns 18, the support just stops. They're handed a trash bag with their belongings and pushed out into the world with nowhere to go. Arthur had saved me from that fate. Now I could do the same for others. We built residential complexes. We funded college scholarships. We hired career coaches and life skills mentors. I'll never forget the day we opened our first center in New York. A girl walked in, no older than 18. She had spiky purple hair and a defiant look in her eyes, a look I knew all too well. She was carrying a black plastic garbage bag, her whole life in a bag. She looked ready for a fight, ready to be disappointed again. She looked exactly how I used to feel. I walked right up to her. "Welcome home," I said. She eyed me with suspicion. "I don't have any money for rent. You don't need money here," I said gently. "All you need is a promise to work hard and let us help." I saw the tension in her shoulders release. I saw the relief wash over her face. It was the best feeling in the world, better than winning any lawsuit, better than any amount of money. But the best thing to come out of that whole year wasn't the foundation. It was Sophie. We had 30 years of life to catch up on. It wasn't always easy. We were strangers bound by blood, sisters raised in two completely different universes. Me with a saint, her with the monsters who created us. We started with coffee every Sunday. At first, the conversation was stilted. We talked about the weather, about her job as a pediatric nurse, a fact that made me smile. She had Arthur's spirit, even though she'd never met him. One rainy afternoon in November, about 3 months after the trial, we were sitting in a small cafe overlooking the river. Sophie looked at the blue woolen hat I was wearing. "Do you wear that hat every day?" she asked. "Almost," I admitted. "It was Arthur's first gift to me." "It looks warm," she said quietly. I took it off and folded it carefully. I reached across the table and handed it to her. Here, I said. Sophie's eyes widened. No, Alex, I can't. That's your armor. I don't need armor anymore, I said, and I knew it was true. I'm safe now. You take it. It's a big sister gift. Sophie took the hat, her hands trembling slightly. She wrapped it around her neck like a scarf, burying her face in the soft wool. It smells like peppermint, she whispered. That's the smell of safety, I said. We sat there for a long time, not speaking, just watching the rain fall on the city streets. For most of my life, silence had been a terrifying thing. Silence was being alone at the airport. Silence was the sound of no one coming for you. Silence was holding your breath, trying to be invisible so you wouldn't get yelled at. But this silence was different. It was warm, comfortable. It was the quiet understanding between two people who had finally found each other. I looked at my sister. I looked out at the rain. I thought about Arthur. He was right all those years ago. They never came back, but he did. And because he did, I was here. I took a sip of my coffee. It was hot and sweet. I wasn't the girl on the duffel bag anymore. I wasn't the victim in the courtroom. I was Alexandra Croft. I was a judge. I was a sister. I was the daughter of Arthur Coleman. And finally, for the first time in 30 years, I was free.